Today my guest is Dane Morgridge. Dane, how are you?
Good. Doing very well.
All right, let's talk about the entity framework.
Okay.
Tell me about it.
Well, Entity Framework is an object relational mapping tool.
Stop. What's an object-oriented relational?
Okay, so an object relational mapping tool, or ORM for short, is a tool that will allow a developer to work with data in objects that make sense to them. And because the database guy has their database the way that they want it, they've got it normalized out, and working with raw SQL statements and things like that can be a bit interesting, a little bit buggy at times. And as developers, we want to work with objects, in object-oriented programming. So the object relational mapper will allow us to work with objects that will then map down to the real database. So I can work with person and address objects as they make sense to me as a developer in my application. But then they persist down through the mapping tool down to the database, so SQL gets generated on the fly. So it basically can save you a lot of time as a developer writing database code. You're not writing a lot of basic SQL stuff, especially when you're doing like your CRUD operations. CRUD is create, read, update, and delete, which is probably 80% of what most developers do with their database. Okay. And so it can save you an extreme amount of time just by simply using these tools, because you're not writing all the basic SQL that you would normally have to do.
Okay, so an ORM, an object relation mapper, this is really a class of products,
yes,
which Entity Framework is one.
Yeah, there's several out there. One of the real popular ones is in Hibernate. That's an open source one. That's probably one of the most popular ones out there.
So what are you using in Hibernate for? You're taking data out of a database and you're mapping it into objects, and you're using that in code, C# code.
Right.
Let me step back a second here. Why do we care about that? We can write. First of all, you said that it'll generate SQL for you, so it'll get the select statements, get data from you, and it'll generate update and insert statements.
Right.
That's great. Mm-hmm. But why are we bothering with objects? Why not just work with data sets?
Well, data sets are pretty limited. I mean, they've got their purpose, but when you pull back a data set, there's first of all a lot of overhead that comes with data sets.
Overhead in terms of?
Just the amount of extra code that has to come back. Okay. Personally, I mean, I haven't worked with data sets a lot in a while since I jumped into the ORM space. But I found them to be, they're great if you want to pull down data and you want to bind it. But when you really want to start working with data, especially in a relational aspect, because an ORM will keep your relationship. So if you look at again the person address scenario, you've got a person that can have multiple addresses, and you can easily work with that relationship in code. So a person would have a collection of addresses that makes sense in code. In a data set, you would have to actually go through, and you might have those collections in the data set, but you would have to go get to them a little separately. So you're still working with data as it sort of feels like it's in the database, but instead of more true objects.
Okay, and I do buy that. It was sort of a rhetorical question, because my response to that is that objects are really the way that I think of the real world.
Right.
So I really don't think of customers as a row and a table.
Right.
I think of a customer as a thing.
Right.
And I think of those addresses as attributes of the customer, as opposed to some related table.
Right.
Which I think is just paraphrasing what you just said. ORM, we got object, the relationships, and this mapping. What are we mapping here?
Well, we're basically mapping, because in the Entity Framework space, we're mapping what's called the Conceptual Model, which is what the developer would work with, to the Physical Model, which is your actual database schema. Okay. So when you take that person and you want to select, data from the database, or query, or save, or however you want to work with it, you work with your objects, and then the mapping part will take those objects and translate that into SQL that is then executed against the database.
Okay. So is it correct to say that one object is equivalent to one row in a table, and one property of an object is equivalent to one column?
Generally,
in a table?
yeah. Most ORMs, especially out of the box, that's normally how they're used.
Okay.
It's a one mapping. Some ORMs you can do like inheritance and things like that, should you want to do that.
So we can't deviate from that if we want to.
Okay.
All right, let's get into Entity Framework then. How does Entity Framework work?
Well, Entity Framework is basically Microsoft's key data technology moving forward. There was obviously Link to SQL that came before it. There's actually an interesting story about Link to SQL, how it came about. And I stumbled across a blog post on this because I was always curious. Link to SQL came out in 2008, and then 2008 Service Pack 1, we get Entity Framework, and a lot of developers were really confused.
Sure.
Well, when you sort of hear the backstory, so that makes a little bit of sense, because what had happened was Link to SQL was kind of a mistake. Not in the sense that it never should have happened, but in the sense it was never planned. What had happened was Link is an awesome technology, but they needed some way to showcase it. Because you can only do so many Link to Objects demos, before it's like, okay, this is cool, but how do I really use it in the business application? So there was a product called Object Spaces, which was an early ORM that Microsoft was working on that never actually shipped. Well, one of the guys that was working on that team was also working on the Link team and said, well, as a demo, let's do Link to Object Spaces, if you will, just to test it. Well, it worked so well, they renamed it and shipped it.
I see.
So, and then the Entity Framework was still in, it's still in planning, it was still being built, and they wanted to get it shipped in 2008, it just wasn't ready. But Link to SQL was, so it got shipped.
So Link to SQL is also an ORM.
Yes.
And it's your database to your objects.
Mm-hmm.
Does essentially the same thing as Entity Framework. Do we need both? Is one going away?
Link to SQL is not necessarily going away. It's not. The work is not going to be done on Link to SQL. All the new work is going to be done on Entity Framework going forward. So Link to SQL, I would say that the rumors of its death have been greatly exaggerated because it's not going to get removed anytime soon. They actually did do some small changes with Visual Studio 2010, so it's still going to be maintained, but it's not their key technology moving forward.
Okay, so if I'm building a new application, it makes more sense to look at Entity Framework.
Yeah, absolutely.
Link to SQL. But if I've got Link to SQL in an existing application, no big deal.
Yeah, not really. Really at this point, if you've got Link to SQL and it's working, and you don't need any of the other features in Entity Framework, at that point, I don't really see any reason to upgrade. But if you've got some of the newer features in Entity Framework, like if you want to take advantage of the POCO or any of the other new features, then migration should be actually relatively easy. To go from Link to SQL to Entity Framework 4 is a pretty easy migration.
Okay. Let's talk about as a developer. I want to start using Entity Framework in my application. What are the steps I need to do?
Okay, pretty much all you have to do is inside your application, just add a new item, and then there's an ADO.NET Entity Data Model under the Data tab, and you just add that, and that will go through and ask you to select the database you want to go against, and you can either use an existing database, or in 2010 there's a model first option where you can actually do database modeling and create your database from an Entity Framework model, which is pretty cool. Yeah. Most people are probably going to already have a database, right. But you go through a little wizard, and then you get a data model that you can then start working with immediately and use Link for data queries, and it's pretty simple.
Okay. So you created this data model, and then you've got a bunch of data, or you've got a bunch of objects in your application. And how do I use those objects?
Okay, well, really everything, it begins and ends with what's called the object context, which is sort of your interface between those objects and the database. So by default, it uses an entity object, which is a object that resembles your database table and inherits from entity object. And then the object context is where you do all your queries from, and it basically passes those objects back and forth, and it does change tracking. So anytime you query an object and then you make a change to it and you go to save it, it actually persists that. But everything really begins and ends with that context.
All right. Sounds pretty simple. It's funny, I used to write a lot of applications that included a layer that did that mapping. I would use ADO.NET to query a database, get back a record set, and the very first thing I would do is loop through that record set or data set and create a list of entity objects on my own.
Yeah, and that's basically, in a nutshell, what it's doing for you.
Right.
But think about all the time that you had writing that code.
Right.
With Entity Framework, it's out of the box. So.
What else can you tell us about Entity Framework?
Well, it's one of the nice things about it is it's included with Visual Studio, so there's no separate downloads. It's right there. All the tools are baked in, which makes it very nice.
If I'm at a point where I'm choosing between InHibernate and Entity Framework and Subsonic and some of the other ORMs that are out there, what factors should I be looking at?
I guess the biggest thing would be, what are you trying to achieve? And if you're trying to achieve just basic data access and you want to get something up and quick, I would definitely go Entity Framework, no question. One of the biggest
Why is that?
Well, first of all, it's baked into Visual Studio. So the tools are really easy. It's part of the it's part of the build process.
Download a little bit less
and it's just all part of Visual Studio, so it makes it a little bit easier. but you don't have to write any files by hand, because in Hibernate you have to craft your mapping files and stuff by hand, which can be a bit of a process. The biggest reason I would choose one over the other is what you're really trying to achieve. If you're trying to achieve extreme testability and extreme configuration, then I would definitely go in Hibernate, because there are more configuration options. Because you're really doing everything by hand, you can, if you've got a table that you need to have columns that are mapped differently, you can do it in any framework, but it's easier just with the conventions that you use in Hibernate to do that.
Okay.
But I think most people, for the data access that they're trying to achieve, any framework is definitely a perfect solution. And I mean, that's where Microsoft is going. So.
Okay. Anything else you can tell us about it?
It's a great tool. The version 4 is out with Visual Studio 2010, and that's definitely the version I would look at. Version 1 was missing some pretty key features. While it was still usable, I've been using it in production since it came out. Version 4 is definitely what you want to look at.
Yeah, versions 2 and 3, a lot of people skipped over those.
Yeah, even Microsoft skipped over those, so it was kind of interesting.
There was no 2, they went right
yeah,
from 1
because
to 4.
the official word is they were just trying to sync the versions of .NET, so we went from 1 to 4. It was a bit of a confusion point for a lot of people.
Sure.
So.
Okay, now there was actually, I remember, do you remember the vote of no confidence?
Yeah, I did actually.
And I'm not really that familiar with what the issues were that this whole crowd had with.
One of the
have those issues been addressed?
Yeah, I believe every single one of those. I believe there were 8 features.
Did you sign that?
No, I did not. Actually, I didn't find out about it until well after it had already taken place. I was searching one day several months ago and came across it. And I'm like, really? That it was because that's.
It wasn't in version 1.0, I think, at the time.
Yeah, well, it was right after. Yeah, it was pretty interesting. But I believe every feature that they said that was missing has been addressed. We've had persistence ignorance now through critical classes, and you have to do a little bit of work. I mean, there's a T4 template you can do to generate it and get there out of the box and still use entity objects. But lazy loading is there now, which I mean, that's one of those features that's kind of cool, but you can shoot yourself in the foot big time with it.
Okay.
But
so it uses lazy loading by default, meaning that it doesn't get data from the database until you actually examine that option itself.
Right. Yeah. So basically, lazy loading will say if I only query the person and not the addresses. If I'm using lazy loading, the first time I go to use the addresses, the Entity Framework's going to say, okay, well, I don't have that data. It's never been loaded, so let's go to the database and get it.
Right.
There's a few problems with that. First of all, you're not really sure necessarily always when it's going to go to the database, because you would be most of the time, but you can't guarantee when it's going to happen necessarily. Also, if you're using ASP.NET VC and you need to pass data down to your view, well, once your context has gone out of scope, there's no more connection to the database. So if you pass your person down to your view and you also need address data, it can't lazy load at that point. So you have to preload that data. Same thing with like a WCF service. If you're passing the data up to a service, it's not going to know how to go back through the service, back through Unity Framework to load the data. So you have to do some preloading there.
And can we change that though with version 4? Can we do eager loading?
Well, you could actually do that with version 1.
Which is the default.
Yeah. Well, it was. It was pretty much there. You've got 2 options. You can do an include off of your initial call, and include the other tables that you want, the other relationships that you want to come back, and it will load all your data at once. Or when you're going through, you can do what's called deferred loading, where you can take that person and you can actually call load off of the addresses collection, and it will at that point go back to the database. So it's like lazy loading, but you're controlling when it happens.
Okay.
So, it just depends on the scenario. So if you knew you always needed all of the addresses all the time, then you'd do it up front. If you didn't, then you could loop through and figure out what you needed. The difference is doing it up front produces one SQL statement with a lot more data,
right.
Whereas you have more calls the other way.
Yeah, so it's more expensive. Hitting the database multiple times or dragging back potentially more data than you might need.
Yeah, so it's one of those, it really depends. Just depends on what you're doing. And
it always depends.
Yeah, always.
That's always the answer.
So.
Okay, anything else?
No, I think that's...
do you have a web presence that you can...
Oh, yeah. If you I have a blog at geekswithblogs.net/Dane Morgridge, and I'm also on Twitter at Dane Morgridge. And Twitter's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. I'm frequently helping people on Twitter.
Are you following me? Am I following you?
I'm not sure.
We'll fix that.
Well, I have to make
sure.
I have to make sure we are.
Tomorrow.
So.
All right, Dan. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I really appreciate it. It's been a great conference here in Pittsburgh, and I'm looking forward to relaxing a little bit.
Yeah, it's definitely been a fun day.
So Dane, what is your favorite online TV show?
Definitely Technology and Friends.